I'm sorry to be so long in starting this, and I hardly know where to begin, but I'll give it a try. My father's parents came over from Ireland and met in Ravenna, Ohio.
Yeah.
They married and later moved to Beach City, Ohio, where my father, Harry Hammel, was born. He was the oldest of 4 children, so it was his job to keep his father on the railroad. He kept the books for his father as soon as he could read and write. He finished the 8th grade, and that was an accomplishment in those days. He later became a section foreman, as you see him in that picture. He was working in Carrollton, Ohio, when he met my mother. She was born in Morning Sun, Iowa, May 11th, 1880. Her father and mother had gone there from Carrollton, Ohio as homesteaders. When my mother, Klara Taupe, was only 2, her mother died of pneumonia, which followed the measles. She and her father, Albert Taupe, he was a carpenter by trade, went back to Carrollton, where she was raised by an old aunt. Her dad remarried. You have the picture of he and his wife and children, and my mother is in black, sitting on the porch. Her dad had his own lumber yard and built his own house. My mother was a beautiful teenager when her stepmother's brother got fresh with her one day, and when her mother told her stepmother, she threatened my mother within an inch of her life if she would tell her dad about this. So my mother ran back to her old aunt and never told her dad. So there were always hard feelings. Then, to make matters worse, she went and married my dad, an Irish Catholic. To this strict Methodist family she had committed a grave offense. Her dad wouldn't see her to the train the morning she and my dad left for Malvern, Ohio, for their wedding in September 1901. She had taken instructions from the priest and often told how scared she was to go to him the first time, as she had heard so many awful stories about priests. Then how happy she was to find out what a dear man he was. She made her own white dress and dressed for the wedding at the rectory. It was a weekday, so there were only a few people in the church. Afterwards, she and Dad took the train to Massillon, Ohio, to where his parents lived then. She often told how they only had red cabbage for dinner, as the message hadn't been received that they were coming, and Dad's folks were so embarrassed, but there was much love and admiration all around. They went back to Carrollton then and rented a little place. My dad was a cornet player in the town band, so they all came and serenaded the newlyweds. My mother worked as a cook in the hotel in Carrollton. That's where she met my dad. They had 4 children while they lived in Carrollton. Wilbur, 1902, John, 1905, Mary, 1907, and Sarah, 1909. Then they moved to Navarre, Ohio, where my dad took over a section for the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad. He worked for them until he was 70 years old. When he was 65, they created a job for him keeping the tracks in shape and the surrounding area, and the railroad station in repair until he was 70. In Navarre, my sister Catherine was born in 1912, and I came along in 1921. My mother was 41, the same age I was when our Kathy was born, and we also had 2 boys and 4 girls. They lived in a little rented house in Worcester Street in Navarre for 48 years, except for a few months when they decided to move to a larger place on Market Street. But it just wasn't home, so they moved back. My sister Sarah worked in a shirt factory in Massillon and then married Raymond Remley in June 1928 when she was 19. My brother Wilbur married Donna Arnold in 1923. They had 3 children. He was working in the Brewster yards for the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad as a brakeman and was killed on the job in November 1929. My brother John was injured working on the railroad unloading cars, and in 1930 he was hospitalized from the head injury in the Massillon State Mental Hospital, where he stayed for 38 years until his death. A year before he died, they moved him to Springfield, Ohio, to treat for heart disease and tuberculosis. Mary married Walter Shannon, a baseball player from St. Louis, in 1939, and they had one son, Walter Shannon Jr. In 1942, January, they were in Columbus, Ohio, preparing to go to St. Louis again, as Walter had a job with the Cardinals as a scout, when Mary was killed in an auto accident. She was 35 and had only been married 10 years. Walter and his son went to St. Louis, and he is still in baseball, right now under contract with the Milwaukee Brewers as assistant manager. Sarah died at age 23 of heart disease. Now the youngest Hammel girl, Ruth Ann. I graduated from Navarre High School in 1939 and went to Massillon Commercial School for 9 months and got a job as a secretary to Mr. E. H. Nelson, VP of Griscom Russell Company. Frank was working there as a timekeeper. We were introduced, and he asked me to the company party, a treasure hunt and dance. He always said I was the treasure he found that night. This was in August 1940. In December 1941, the Pearl Harbor attack came. He said he was signing up for the Air Force. He took me and a few friends along to help convince his parents to sign for him. This was necessary even though he was 21. They signed reluctantly in January, and he left in March 1942 for San Antonio, then to Parks Air College in St. Louis, Missouri for beginners training. From there he went to Enid, Oklahoma for basic training. Having made it that far, he felt sure he would make it all the way and become an officer and a pilot of fighter planes. So in October, he proposed by mail, and I accepted by return mail. He bought a ring in Enid, and he mailed it to me. On his birthday, December 2nd, I left Massillon by train, stopped over for a few hours' visit with Walter Shannon and my nephew Wally, as Mary had just died in January of that year. I arrived in Enid, Oklahoma on a Saturday morning, December 5th. I picked up the marriage license, bought flowers, and talked to the priest, and we were married that evening at 6 in St. Francis Xavier Church, with only a couple friends present. The end of basic training party was being held at the hotel, a big dinner dance, so we considered it our wedding party. We stayed at the hotel till Monday morning, and then he went to the air base. I went to share a room with other Air Force wives and didn't see him again until we were all moved out by train the next Saturday, December 12th, for Lake Charles, Louisiana. Never having been on a troop train and never having been in the South, I found this all very exciting. Another Air Force wife from Ohio and I teamed up. We found a room to share in Lake Charles. She just got a job as a nurse in the local hospital, and I found a job as a secretary. 6 weeks later, we all moved to Victoria, Texas, where Frank received his commission as second lieutenant and his wings. He was then sent to Tallahassee, Florida as an instructor. We lived there in an efficiency apartment for a few months. Then his new assignment was as an instructor in Perry, Florida. The O'Quinn family owned a large tourist home on Main Street in Perry. They rented all their rooms out to 6 couples of us. We ate all our meals at a makeshift restaurant in the town drugstore on the square. When it finally looked as though the Air Force would keep us there for a while, we rented an apartment, actually our first home, and actually a one-room efficiency above a garage. A few months later, we found a little bungalow to share with our dear friends Jim and Pal Reese of Pensacola, Florida. Pal's little girl Martha was born in March. We moved in June. Frankie was born June 19th. We had to drive to Tallahassee, Dale Mabry Field, for his birth. When he was 4 weeks old, Dad was on a gunnery mission over the Gulf of Mexico when his plane sprung a leak and went into the Gulf. He bailed out and swam for miles until the Coast Guard boat picked him up. He was flown to Tallahassee for stitches under his eye, but was fine after a few days. The plane is probably still in the Gulf. In October of that year, 1944, we were sent to a base in North Carolina for a few weeks, then on to Suffrage Field in Michigan. They were preparing Dad's group to go to Iwo Jima. We had an apartment in Mount Clemens, Michigan, but Frankie came down with whooping cough, so I had to take him to Kent, Ohio, where he and I stayed with Frank's parents. Frank left in March for Iwo Jima and didn't get home until January 1946. The wars were over, and we had to decide where to go with our lives. We rented a duplex in a government housing project in Windham, Ohio, near Ravenna. Frank went back to finish college at Kent State. He got his degree in business in 1948 and started working for Griscom Russell Company in Massillon. So we moved to a duplex in a government housing project in Massillon. It was called Walnut Hills. Tom was born in Warren, Ohio, while we lived in Windham, October 1946. In November 1950, we moved to Morris Plains, New Jersey. Griscom Russell sent Frank to work as an estimator in the home office in New York City. We rented a beautiful house there, furnished for 6 months. The owners rented it every winter while they were in Florida. We met some wonderful people and took in the sights of New York City. Our Christmas there was memorable. Our neighbors, Jim and Catherine Smith, took us under their wings as they didn't have children, and we became lifelong friends, corresponding until they died 10 or 15 years later. April 1st, the home office was moved back to Massillon, Ohio, so we bought our first home in Oakdale Allotment off Wales Road in Massillon, Ohio. Mary was born in August 1951. We lived in this lovely old brick house on Columbia Avenue for 10 years. Natalie was born in 1954 and Janice in November 1956.